Okay, so you sent us something really interesting.
Yeah.
A daily reflection, right? A spiritual reflection called Gabage.
Yeah.
And it translates to morning flute, I guess, morning message,
Okay.
from March 14th, 2025. And
Yeah.
I got to say, what got me right away, I mean, right off the bat, was this
Yeah.
focus on having this sort of like happy face all the time, like this happy demeanor.
Right. Right.
But it's not just like a nice suggestion or something, right? It seems really deeply tied
Mm-hmm.
to this idea of remembering God, who's referred to as Baba in the text,
Yeah.
and then how that remembrance like impacts our inner peace
Mm-hmm.
and our overall spiritual journey.
Mm.
So what we want to do today, I mean, what we're going to do in this deep dive is to really look at the core instructions
Yeah.
and the insights from this morning message, right? Like extract the key ideas so that you listening
Right.
can really get the essence of it, the real like core meaning.
Absolutely. And, you hit the nail on the head. It's more than just feeling happy, right? What's so interesting here is that it's like this outward sign of this inner realization. So it's the joy that comes from knowing and really internalizing that God teaches us.
Yeah.
And I think about you and how you're so focused on getting knowledge quickly, but thoroughly, right? And to do that, you need to have a happy, receptive mind.
Yeah, it hits you right away
Absolutely.
with this very first instruction.
Like, your face should always be cheerful. The happiness that God teaches us should be visible on your face.
Right.
It really makes you wonder, like, why start there? Why is that like the first thing,
Yeah, and I think it's about, it feels like embodying this joy is like the first step, right?
Yeah, totally.
It's the foundation. Is it possible that like expressing this joy outwardly actually reinforces the feeling? Like it creates kind of like a loop.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it shows, it's like a signal, right, to ourselves, but also to everyone around us that there's something deeper going on.
Right. Okay, so moving on, right? Because the next part really gets into what seems like the core practice here.
Okay.
It talks about these Kosho Garyo, which is pronounced Mukhya Purusharth, which is like the main endeavor, like the main spiritual endeavor.
Okay.
And it's described as like being freed from punishment, kani and kana.
Right.
And the way to get this freedom is through kanan kane, which is like the journey of remembrance.
Right.
And it says that this destroys negative karma. Kutone.
Right.
So can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit? Like, what is this about remembrance and how does it affect our karma?
Well, what's really interesting is that it makes this direct link, right, between remembering and getting rid of our, our bad karma.
All right.
So it's not passive, it's active. It's something you have to do.
Okay.
The text actually says, so it's like if you remember with love, you'll accumulate a lot of, spiritual earnings.
I know.
And I think about that early morning remembrance. They talk about
Right.
So it's important to start your day, thinking about this, remembering, detaching from the world, right? And absorbing this spiritual wisdom.
Yeah, it's like setting an intention for the whole day.
Yeah, exactly.
And I noticed how they specifically say to avoid kaja kanka, which is like, negative or impure talk.
Yeah.
It's almost as if like, okay, you've cultivated this positive energy by remembering, but then you've got to protect it, by avoiding negativity.
Absolutely. If we think about mental well-being as a whole, right, that makes sense.
Right.
If you're always in these negative conversations, thinking impure thoughts,
right, it's
going to cloud your mind.
Yeah.
And then it makes it so much harder to keep that joyful state.
Right. Okay, so there's this song that's mentioned, Kanawakli Katrinus Pompes mostly.
Yeah.
Having found you, I.
Okay.
And it's connected to this deep joy of knowing that God teaches us, God gives us the sovereignty of the world. Yeah. That's a big inheritance. It is. It's a huge inheritance.
Yeah.
And you know what? I think it's really important to point out that even the text recognizes that it's not easy to maintain this feeling of bliss all the time.
Like it even says, Murli line, which means that remembrance doesn't stay permanent.
Right. Right, so they're not sugarcoating it.
No.
Like,
No.
this is hard work.
Yeah, it is. But the comparison it makes to worldly studies, right? It says that the joy you get from learning from God should be even more than the happiness you find, being a student, studying other things.
Okay, so for you, where do you find, like, the deepest joy and sense of purpose?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think for me, I really find it in those moments of stillness, right? Where I can connect to something bigger than myself, and it's not always easy to get there, but it's so worth it.
Right. Okay. So the Murli also tells us to listen to these songs over and over.
Right.
Like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, yeah.
And that seems to highlight this need to really like reinforce these ideas.
Absolutely, because we forget, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's so easy to forget God and forget about this inheritance.
Right.
And then we just end up remembering the old world, our old relationships.
Yeah, and even dwelling on, court, do it, which is like, old rotten garbage. It's like the negative stuff from our past.
It is. It's all that baggage we carry around.
Right.
And I think that's something we all struggle with, this forgetfulness, this attachment to things that aren't serving us.
Right. And then they ask this question, that's Anconte. What else is needed? And it's like they're saying, look, you're studying to be the master of the entire world.
Right.
What else could you possibly need?
And it's true, right? Like that sense of purpose should be enough to fill you with joy.
Yeah.
And they even say, I didn't malagita kanoko kontoko, which means that you might even need less sleep.
Right. Like you're so energized by it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so then they describe like this ideal state. It's someone who's constantly remembering this divine teacher and this incredible inheritance with, they use the word tantais, which is like someone who's like blissfully intoxicated.
But, then immediately it talks about the big obstacle, Maya, which is that illusion that stops us from remembering, and it pulls our mind to these more worldly, often negative thoughts.
Right. So it's like this constant battle for our attention.
It is. And it's interesting because they contrast how people engaged in these worldly things. They're often cheerful. But then this deep joy that should come from being taught by God, it's so much less common.
Yeah.
They say that ideally, which means that this barometer of happiness should remain at an unfathomable high.
And it seems like one of the big challenges is that we forget the Ankanti, like the unlimited Father, even while we're receiving teachings.
Sure.
And the Murli talks about a Kuniner. Like the burden of our past karma, the consequences.
And I think that is such a huge obstacle.
Yeah.
Because it stops us from remembering and it makes us focus on negativity.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge, like, not everyone's the same.
Right.
The text says, no. Like, they are number-wise. So everyone's at a different level in this practice of remembrance.
Yeah, so there's this amazing analogy where they compare worldly education to this spiritual guidance. So they say that, like, a teacher prepares someone to become a barrister.
Right.
God teaches us to become a barator, like a divine being. And it says, this should fill us with so much joy. The Kaneda Horseback, how much intoxication should there be?
Yeah, and of course they're not talking about like, literal intoxication. Right. It's that feeling of joy and purpose, knowing that you're connected to something so much greater. And they even talk about human gurus, right?
Yeah.
Whose role is usually just to guide you towards God. But here, it's God himself who's teaching us directly.
Right.
This Father explains so much in front of us.
Right. And it's emphasized that we really have to remember the one who's teaching and giving us this inheritance of kindness that they've been taking. Do remember the teacher who is teaching you.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that they say even good students, even those who are considered good students, don't always remember.
It's so easy to forget, right? And it really highlights how special a red is.
Oh.
The ocean of knowledge, the bestower of this inheritance.
Right, and how remembering that should really make us feel happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so to move forward on this path, we need this path.
Mm-hmm.
The destruction of negative karma. And God actually promises. It's it may status abundante is just stated high just naman kapering the size of negocios. He's going to entertain sustain by the what you know God sai that expanded what you any. Okay, I'll get you. May the Korama's basic will be destroyed. I guarantee this. Don't remember anyone except the one Father.
That's a big promise, right?
And it is, and it connects back to not dwelling on and like now Gunnar Kutter's like perishable things,
right?
And it's so different, from how we do things in the world, where we spend so much time remembering those who have passed,
right?
But here, it's all about the eternal.
Yes, it is, and it's about remembering with love. Right? Yeah. Because that's what helps us burn away those past actions and really build up our spiritual merit.
Right. And they even say to start today by remembering God.
Yeah.
Which is really similar, to a lot of devotional practices. Yeah. But here, it's paired with this understanding of spiritual knowledge and our connection to the divine.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's this really strong caution against getting caught up in the like the mud, the negativity of the old world, even after we gain some understanding.
Right.
And they say that some people, they just constantly talk negatively, and that really holds them back.
Absolutely.
So it's about consciously choosing, what we focus on, both mentally and verbally.
Yeah.
They even give an example of people who are really dedicated to service, who are gone, and it's like these people naturally remember God.
Yeah.
Because their energy is going towards his work.
Right.
And they even give a specific example who is described as being really dedicated to service.
Yeah, so it seems like selfless service is a way to deepen our connection to God.
Right, exactly. And the Murli even gives us a tool to use when we're feeling down.
Okay.
Like when sadness comes, listen to uplifting songs or recordings.
Yeah, so it's like having these resources to help us shift our mental and emotional state.
Yeah, to bring us back to remembrance.
Right.
So what's really amazing is that something so transformative is actually so simple.
Right.
Upon Pantateanam kinda, the Father only says, remember me.
Right.
And they say that this study is easy. We have tools like these recordings. But, it's still easy to forget.
It is.
And Maya can lead us away.
And it's interesting because they say that remembrance is how you transform a edarta, which is an intellect filled with impurity, into an intellect of purity.
So it's about directing our focus.
Yeah.
And they also talk about how remembrance helps us discern right from wrong. It's bounce cook, I'm not Kurt, I'm all cooking me. The intellect to think about right and wrong has been received.
And that call to God, the Yudhahar, O purifier of the fallen, come, shows that we need to become pure.
Right. And it brings us to, I got that sort of command, the burden of countless births. And how remembering God leads to purity and happiness.
So they ask, that's one of the time. Is like, how much time do we remember the Father?
Yeah, it's like they're asking us to look at ourselves, honestly.
Yeah, and it's hard to keep track, right? Like they even talk about keeping a chart of our remembrance. But even if it's hard, they say it's so powerful.
Yeah.
Like if we stay in remembrance while giving a talk, it gives us strength.
It came to just saying, I'm going on to my family like I tell the card is Alcamo so. Right?
Okay, so then there's this part where they talk about how God actually helps us through others.
Right.
Hi, I can't like more the hogs up the can and I myself go and help many. By entering someone, I myself go and do service.
And I think that's really comforting to know that we have that support.
Yeah.
But they also say that we can't let ego come in when we're serving.
Right.
Because what really matters is our inner state.
Okay. So we come back to this main effort,
Uh-huh.
achieving freedom from suffering through this remembrance.
Yeah.
And the Murli reminds us
Mm.
how hard it can be.
It does.
It even gives an example of someone who stayed pure for 10 years.
But then fell because of Maya.
You know, Maya can make us forget everything.
Right.
God, our inheritance.
Yeah.
It's like a storm that throws us off course.
So we need to become
Mm-hmm.
like detached from our desires and our bodies.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to
Mhm.
interact with those who might be less advanced spiritually.
Right.
It's about introducing them to this path and helping them become worthy of that inheritance.
But they're very specific about how we should do this.
Right.
It needs to be through detached love.
Right.
But no attachment of deep affection should remain.
So it's about having compassion
Yeah.
for both ourselves and others.
Right. And it really reflects God's mercy.
Absolutely.
So they really emphasize that we need to show our spiritual progress through service,
Mm-hmm.
specifically by introducing others to God.
Right.
And they even say, give feedback. How can we do this better?
Yeah, and it's so hard to stay in remembrance sometimes, right?
Ah.
Like they even talk about remembering while we're eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we need to be remembering God even when we're moving around.
Yeah.
And they say, don't chatter aimlessly. Like, oh, well, we'll throw it there.
Yeah, and it's about gently bringing our thoughts back to God
Right.
when we notice they've drifted.
Okay, so balancing our worldly duties with remembrance is really key here.
Yeah.
And they say that eventually we should aim for at least 8 hours of remembrance.
Wow.
But they acknowledge that Maya is always there.
It is. It's constantly trying to distract us.
Right.
And I think it's interesting that even the speaker in the text admits that it's hard to maintain that remembrance.
Uh-huh.
Like they're also struggling.
Right.
But even though it's hard, it's so simple.
Yeah.
And the rewards are so great.
Right. And they talk about how these teachings are everywhere.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The teachings reach everyone.
So the knowledge is available to everyone.
Yeah.
But we have to be interested in listening, right?
Right.
Like really cultivate that interest in hearing the Murli.
Yeah, and then they talk about the song. Baba, we have come to take our inheritance. And I love how they accept everyone, regardless of their current state.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
however I am, so I am. I am yours.
But they also encourage us to become better. And like under Kankalo about the fact that ones should become better than something impure, shouldn't they?
Right.
And it all comes down to yoga, which is that remembrance and studying the teachings.
Yeah, so the last thing they talk about
Okay.
is this vision of the future
Uh-huh.
and how our effort now is so important. They say that we should all be thinking about
Yeah.
what our status will be in heaven.
It's like, okay, we're going to get there, but what will our position be?
Right. And it depends on our study and how well we imbibe these divine qualities.
And I think that hierarchical structure in the future world is really interesting.
It really highlights how important our effort now is.
It does. It does.
And how much respect we can earn through our spiritual study.
And I love that they remind us that God is always guiding us towards remembrance and peace.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, that they point out that sometimes people who are physically distant can actually have deeper remembrance and attain a higher status.
Right. And it's like that analogy from devotion.
Yeah.
Where some devotees surpass even their gurus.
And the Murli suggests that those with strong devotion in the past are naturally drawn to this knowledge and they can understand it more easily.
It really shows how our past efforts connect to our present understanding.
Absolutely.
So ultimately what they're saying is remember God constantly to destroy those negative karmas and become really, really sweet.
Yeah.
All right, so to kind of sum it all up,
Okay.
we started with this focus on having a happy face.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just superficial.
Right.
It's a reflection of knowing that God is our teacher.
Yeah.
And the core spiritual effort is remembrance.
Right, that journey of remembrance.
Which purifies our karma and leads to spiritual liberation. And this whole morning message is filled with this idea of joy that comes from studying and the hope of this inheritance.
Absolutely.
So here's something for you to think about, okay?
Okay.
How would remembering this divine teacher throughout the day, even while you're doing your regular things, change your inner experience? Could this practice be the key to having more joy and freedom from negativity than you can even imagine right now?
Wow, that's something to really consider.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface here.
Right.
I mean, there's so much more to explore in these teachings.
Yeah, absolutely.
So really consider how these principles might resonate in your life,
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway.
All right, until next time.
See you then.